Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie Couch with Lucas Aurelio. Lucas is a Spanish-American actor, originally from Albany, New York. Growing up, he spent his summers between New York and Madrid, Spain. While still at school, Lucas began performing in off-Broadway plays and secured acting roles in TV and film. And after graduating from drama school, Lucas moved to the UK and he's now lived in London for 5 years. You can catch him in Series 3 of Bridgerton on Netflix. Lucas Aurelio, welcome to the Marie Curie Couch.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. How are you?
I'm good. I know we're recording this for a later date, but at this present moment, the show has dropped yesterday and we've been waiting, or I have been waiting, my character and me for the last year and a half plus. It's been a long time coming, and the responses in the last 24 hours already have been incredibly positive, and I'm just super grateful. I'm just super grateful and to see how it continues to sort of unravel.
Well done.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, for joining me today on the Marie Curie Couch and giving up some of your really precious time, especially at this time. I think Lucas, that this podcast, we talk about death and dying. For people who listen, we know that they find it helpful when they're grieving themselves, if they've experienced a bereavement. They find it helpful to hear other people's stories because it makes them feel less alone. And it's also helpful to hear how other people manage their grief and bereavement and deal with it and how it impacts. I think one of the other reasons we do this podcast is to encourage conversations around death and dying. So to try and normalize those conversations, because they're very taboo and people don't usually have them. People will often avoid them. And what we know through our work is if people are open to having those conversations, planning for the future, then they and those around them can have better experiences when the time comes. So to start the conversation, Lucas, can I ask if you've experienced a significant bereavement in your life?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the major losses, and I'll go back a bit, that I experienced in my life was first off, my cat. When I was planning to go to university, and I think I was away that weekend sort of doing a visit and sort of some work, and to this day was, of all the pets I've had, was my closest companion, was the one that spent the most time with me in my bed. And we were driving home from my weekend away at the university, and it was my parents sort of saying like he had to be put down, he lost the ability to walk all over that weekend. And that was pretty visceral. And speaking of imposter syndrome or sort of like, sort of feeling like it was an inadequate loss, like I've been very fortunate. I've been very, very privileged throughout my life from from the family I've had, I'd say. From the get-go, that's the one thing. And also not to have lost that many people early on. But then later on, about 2 years ago, I lost my grandfather. And that was a really bizarre loss in the sense that because I didn't spend as much time with him, because he wasn't someone that, was living in the house, or he lived in New York City. Me and my parents and my sister, we lived in Albany. There was still some distance. So it was always like going to see him. And when we lost him, I didn't quite know how to feel in that regard. It sort of reached his time, and it sort of made sense. There was a lot of grieving. It was really, really tough to see my uncles and my dad and how they took it. but I reflected a lot on it. I think I was trying to make sense of why my feelings weren't so like clear, like why I didn't feel the same level of sort of like of loss that I was seeing my own uncle and my father experience. Then a few months ago, about six to 7 months ago, I lost my agent, which we were quite close. He was 36 years old. And so this last winter was a lot, like, was sort of culmination of those feelings and sort of going, I think death became a really prominent sort of topic in my like internal dialogue, and like the fear of dying myself, the fear of losing my parents, the fear of all of that. And losing Marvin was a really, really tough one because he was my agent. We had a business relationship, but those who knew me and my relationship to Marvin knew that it was also very different to most relationships with agents. We were friends, we went out. He would come to, parties that I threw at my house. We would essentially break bread together a lot. I met his friends and had even gotten closer to his friends since his passing, which was, is still to this point such a bizarre thing. Surely we would have been friends if we got along and I'd met them and I would have embraced them because they were friends with Marvin. But it's so interesting in that through loss, more relationships were built and built with stronger foundations. But I will cap it off with saying that, to bring it back to my grandfather, was I was scrolling through my phone and sometimes this like automated voicemail works on your phone where you can see, oh, so-and-so has left you a message and all this. And for some reason it started working again. It never did. I'd always have to call up the voicemail. And there's a voicemail left by my grandfather. And I was sat in this park in Hackney and it was labeled by my uncle. So when I clicked the play button, I was expecting my uncle. And as soon as it started playing and I saw the sort of like written caption, the AI sort of caption, like, oh, this is what it says. As soon as I read the first words before it even spoke, I was like, oh, this isn't my uncle. And I was a puddle by the end of it. I called my dad and things like, I knew that this wasn't typically something that my grandfather did. He wasn't always the first one to say, I love you. He typically said it in return. But he left that call, and my father said he didn't normally do that. He didn't call people out of the blue too much and just sort of give them well wishes. And it just made me miss him, and sort of floods of emotion, like, and feelings like shame. And should I have done more? And why wasn't I like this 2 years ago? But there's one thing I've taken away is to be kind to yourself and sort of understand that, like, he wasn't upset. He was pleased with me. I guess I'm still sort of processing it, but same as the Bridgerton stuff. It's gratitude. I think it gives me a lot of gratitude that I had someone like him, like Marvin, like my cat Kitty, to get me to this point.
Thank you. There's lots in there that I just kind of want to come back on a few things and just make some comment. I think the first one is I'm really pleased you got that message. I'm really pleased that message came through on the voicemail, and didn't get kind of lost somewhere, and just how interesting it come through later on and, had been sat there from your grandfather. Going back to what you were saying about when your grandfather died and watching your uncles and your dad, so they were grieving their father, and how your experience to theirs was different, how you were perceiving it. They were responding in different ways to how you were responding. And I think that's a really, really important thing to talk about, specifically for listeners, for people listening, because so many people, when they're grieving, wonder if they're getting it right because others around them are responding differently, or they're seeing people react differently. So are they crying enough? Are they sad enough? Are they feeling all the emotions they should be feeling? Are they feeling them too much? Is this normal? Is this right? Some of the behaviors I might be doing, I'm listening to the voice message on repeat. I'm wearing his sweatshirt every night in bed. Is that right or is that wrong? So many questions we kind of ask ourselves and judge ourselves on our experience of grief, and is it the right way? And I suppose my response to that is one, which is something I often mention on the podcast, is our grief response is very closely linked to the relationship we had with the individual. So if we had a complex relationship with the individual, we're likely to have a more complex grief response. If it was somebody who, let's talk about a geographical closeness, if you like, or a physical closeness, or a family, so your dad and your uncles were grieving their father, but you didn't have as geographically close and maybe emotionally close relationship with your grandfather, so you were having a different experience. But you were kind of questioning yourself a bit as to whether it was the right one. Well, you were having a grief experience based on something that more similarly mirrored the relationship you had with him. And the relationship you had with him was a different one to what your dad had. And actually, your dad had a different relationship with him than your uncles did, each of them all having different and unique relationships of their own. So therefore, we talk about grief and bereavement being unique to the individual, being you, but unique to the relationship you had with that person. So therefore, if that's the case, we can't have a right or wrong if we're comparing, because we can't compare.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah, I mean, my dad was sort of dealing with and it was only 2 years ago, but it felt, I mean, with COVID and 2 years ago, I didn't sort of secure this job. This job, it did change a lot for me in terms of outlook and everything. And so looking 2 years ago, it does feel like a whole different world. But I remember my dad being really like planning and everything. Like one of my uncles had lived with my grandfather really up until the end. And my dad was up in Albany with us, and when it was time to sort of deal with the funeral and sort of the arrangements of what was going to happen, I sort of just remember my dad being sort of ticking lists off, and I didn't really witness him being too emotional until it was, I guess, the moment of sort of the day where we saw him. He was sort of presented, and yeah, it's one of those things where you just witness a sort of physical bodily reaction to sort of see that come out of, I mean, first anyone, but let alone, one of the people that have raised you, to sort of just lose sort of control over even like how their face contorts and the sounds that they make. I mean, I will never forget it. And I don't mean to be like, but well, what can I take from it? But there was stuff that I took from it. You said that I was questioning the way I was reacting. I was questioning whether I was a bad person, and you were saying things as well, like, should I be wearing the shirt that belonged to them to sleep, or should I not? For me, hearing that, it's like, of course there's nothing wrong with that. But then I'm asking the fact, like, well, I was always an emotional kid growing up. I used to cry at the dime of, of anything, of just literally anything. And yet this thing happened and I was not crying. It's a good thing. I think it's a good attribute to have. But in life, and adulting happens, and you cry less and less. And I didn't cry that much when it was sort of happening, when I was witnessing all this. And I thought there was something wrong with me. And I guess I'm saying that when you're going through it and it's a specific thing that you're struggling to understand, that it is valid. What I'm saying is it's a fascination. It really is fascinating how I've sort of ingested every sort of life-changing moments when it relates to sort of loss.
I just wanted to go back to a couple of other things you said, which I think is another really important one. And thank you for mentioning Kitty and, the loss of a pet and a cat. In your case, I think people do struggle with that as well, because we probably tend to, not everybody, I'm making a judgment here, but we probably tend to kind of not make a joke of it, but actually just be a bit lighter in our delivery about it. And the response back would often be lighter as well. So maybe we're light in the delivery because we know, or we think we can only expect quite a light response back, because it's like, well, can you really say that you're absolutely heartbroken or devastated because this physical being was, I mean, you mentioned being in the same bed, so this is someone that you're close to in a physical way as well, just that kind of, and you're young, and we often have pets for a really, really long time in our lives, and they're hugely significant members of the family, and often for children and young people can be best friends. So thank you for mentioning Kitty as well, because I think it's an often unrecognized grief, but an as significant one.
And I didn't know it at the time. I mean, talking about expectation, I mean, the expectation of how you're supposed to react to that loss, like you said, is going to be softer and is expected to be less intense. And so because I hadn't lost, people really close to me, like, for example, my parents at an early age, and wasn't forced to sort of like deal with the realities of that, or losing a provider or a caretaker, it is in a way still presented very softly. I mean, one thing is the expectation, and then one thing was sort of like how much you're being asked to sort of digest and deal with, because there's always that moment after death. I mean, not again, I haven't lost my parents, which I would say is sort of what drove me to Marie Curie. Like, I reached out to one of the Bridgerton castmates who I knew was working with the charity, and it was because of a day after having lost Marvin, my agent, and fearing the loss of my parents. And I think it was a response of trying to like control something. So losing a parent, and I can only imagine losing a parent early on, where you're forced to deal with the realities of that as a child, is going to be very different to losing a parent, at the age of 40. And that being said, it's still going to be intense. It was still me, with all the, the fortune that I feel that I've had, and sort of still having my parents here and all that. It still didn't change the fact that I was still afraid. My reason for reaching out, I think, was a subconscious, like, motivated response to wanting to sort of control an emotion that I may or may not have when my parents are gone. And so then reflecting on, like, the loss of Kitty as well, and thinking, like, in that moment, like, should I, again, it was more stuff. It's constantly questioning that and understanding that that's okay. It's okay. It's okay if you don't feel immense amount of emotion in the point, because when I lost Marvin, it was very conflicted. A business relationship as well as a personal relationship. It was very unique to other relationships that I knew actors and agents had. But when that moment came, I mean, the emotions flooded. It flooded, especially in particular with moments hearing from others. People who were close to me knew my relationship with Marvin through me. But hearing people who knew me and Marvin's relationship through Marvin before passing, and coming to me and being like, I knew how close you guys were and how much he believed in you and how much he trusted you. And I think that was something I wasn't prepared for at all. So it is a learning process. Again, I'm super grateful that my parents are around, still around, but I know that they always won't be. You have to do your best to enjoy the present, I guess, while they're here, and I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to talk a bit about, well, I'd want to acknowledge what you said in relation to Marvin's death. Was when you talked about it, it sounded like it was quite profound, in that you said how it had obviously had a big impact, because this was a friendship as well as a business relationship. So it was somebody you cared for. And I think you felt the loss so significantly that also it made you think about your own death. And, we often, when somebody who dies close in age to what we are, then we're often faced with our own mortality. Because it's like, well, if it can happen to them, then maybe it could happen to me. And so that brings a different perspective on it. And we might experience some different things with those losses than we would with others. And I think also, just jumping back to Kitty's death, I think for children and young people in their 20s, and or even people who might be older, if they've never had any other losses in their life, but the first loss is a loss of a pet, that helps in developing that kind of understanding of grief and bereavement, and almost preparing you, but gives you something to reflect on and think about, because each loss that we have throughout our life, we're going to have a different experience because we had a different relationship with the individual, but there'll be some fundamental things that are the same. And so certainly in how we deal with it and manage it, and the things that might help us, we might go back to them.
Even in just saying that, I am reflecting even on the loss. So I'm half Spanish and then half New Yorker, upstate New Yorker. And so, the grandfather that I lost 2 years ago was on my father's side, the US side. When I was born, I had both my grandfathers. And my Spanish grandfather, he still lives in Madrid, and I lost him when I was about 8, 9, early on in life. But he lived in Madrid. He lived just outside Madrid. I lived in New York and would visit it often. And he was such a big personality. I mean, sort of where he differed from my grandpa Jean, my grandfather Aurelio, which is my middle name, Lucas Aurelio. He was a big personality. He was loud. He would say I love you, I love you, I love you, precioso, like my precious. And he was like that with so many of us. I think there's 19 of us cousins. So we're a big family, and he adored each one of us. But for me, when I would go visit him, usually in the summers, my Spanish was rustier compared to my cousins living there. And so the fact that he was loud and spoke so fast, it used to be really tough to understand the love and affection that he was giving me. It was scary at times. My sister was even scared at times because it was like, oh my God, what is he doing? But he was loving. It was never that, I wasn't scared. It was mostly just like, I can't understand everything. And what's he sort of shouting at us? And it was when he got sick and was forced to slow down. I mean, it was his whole body was slowing down. The way he spoke, the way he emoted, it all quieted down. And I remember one of the last times that we visited him in the hospital. And I sort of picked this apart when I was that age, which is kind of crazy to me. I didn't plan to sort of speak about this, even, before we started the recording, but he said all the same things. He said all the same things he did to me growing up, and how much he loved me, and how, calling me his precious, and how beautiful he thought he was. These like sort of statements that you don't normally hear in sort of like English American culture. Especially between two men. But he just loved me, and I could hear it that time. The relationship he had with a lot of my cousins, where he would drive them to the cinema and go to parks and all this. How influential he was in raising them, which I didn't have, being in a different country. That moment was really important to me because I saw all my cousins see that same level of appreciation and love for him, and the conflict I had with it felt really resolved in that moment. And I'm really glad that it was right before he passed away, because then it turned into, the funeral that they had for him in my family's pueblo, in the town just outside of Madrid, was like a visceral moment of seeing this whole town that he used to be the mayor of, and my uncle was, later on. And to see the whole kind of town rally around, it was like, oh my God, like that was a huge moment of gratitude as well, where it's like, wow, I mean, I feel guilty and that it took me so long to really hear what he was saying to me. But I'm glad I was able to come to a realization before. And then just having the sort of the blank emotions at the funeral and seeing people just like in tears and in wrecks and being like, at that time, unlike, now with Marvin, where I was just like, why aren't I immediately like crying? At that time, I was just like, what is happening? Like, what does this mean? How did this many people turn out? And then, the giant crosses being carried through the streets, which is not something that is done, in the States. So just the grandeur of it, surrounded around death. It makes sense now. I think it's sort of like a bizarre way of celebrating. Everything he sort of like gave to me, my cousins, my aunts and uncles. I mean, they all adored him. And so to see that was immense. And then to see it, in a different form with my uncles, with my grandpa Jean later on. Yeah, I mean, I totally forgot about that until you started talking about between Kitty and
And
Marvin.
it's a really beautiful story, Lucas, as well. And thank you for sharing it. I think just, you know, you're sort of highlighting cultural differences there. And it's interesting how cultural differences, even as we know, of course, impact death and grief. And your Spanish grandfather with his boisterous, if you like, but just his bigger displays of love and affection. And therefore, there was a bigger display of grief and faith and religion at the funeral. But I love that you heard what he was saying in those quieter moments when he was less well. And what I particularly like is, because it's a word I really love, it's up there with one of my favorites, is the word precious. It's such a lovely word, and just how he was able to show you that men can express love for each other in different ways, and that's okay. And yeah, that you were precious to him. When I think about the word precious, I think about holding something physically, I think actually, like in my hand. I'm probably thinking of a precious stone, but just holding something. And so I'm really pleased that he gave you that to hold.
He would hold us. He would do the again, very, very culturally different things where it's Spanish. It's just, he's sort of like, precioso, and you would just like, kiss you on the top of your head, like over and over. You would just like you do with like a cat,
Yeah.
you can't help but, and he was just like, I adore you. And he's like, what do they want? I can get candies and all that. And, grief, I've really like sort of like keying in on it, acknowledging it, has been probably this year. It was a really rough winter, and a few other pretty like life sort of changing sort of events happened, for better and for worse. But they made me really reflect on how fragile it all is. But the guilt that sort of comes with grief, that is sort of what surprised me. And the guilt that I had with my Spanish grandfather was like, why did it take him being sick? It's one thing to say slow down, but the reason he slowed down was because he got sick. So I've thought of like, I feel really guilty that it took him being ill for me to have to realize that. And I know that like, sort of carrying that with me as if I like made this grand mistake and that he would resent me for it is ridiculous. It serves no one any good. But what I know, how it can serve me is going, okay, well, like, picking moments where I'm annoyed with my mom, for example, for being overbearing, or maybe my sister, or my dad. And it doesn't always happen, because sometimes the heat of the moment is like, I don't like that you said that, and I don't like this. But especially in those moments where I was reflecting on the mortality of my own parents, and when I'm upset and sort of can like calm down and then reflect on it and go like, this person wants nothing but the best for me.
Marie Curie's mission is to close the gap in end-of-life care. We're here for anyone with an illness they're likely to die from, and those close to them. Whatever the illness, wherever you are, we're with you to the end. Find out more at mariecurie.org.uk.
Is there anything that you found helpful in grief? Anything that's particularly helped you? So maybe after Marvin died and when you were grieving his death.
I mean, you touched on it so well at the beginning, Jason. It's, there is no right or wrong way. There is no pre-written sort of way to feel or way to interpret intrusive thoughts, especially, as I'm still quite young. I'm 28, recently turned. But each year has shown, the difficulties of reality and how that changes things and how it changes you and how it changes, the people around you and who stays and who goes. But I think when something like that happens, when you lose someone, is being kind to yourself. And it's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard to actually be kind to yourself sometimes when you feel like there's a missed opportunity or a regret or anything. But knowing that, like, you are enough, you're enough, the way you're feeling is enough. It's valid. It's important even. And finding love in there when you can. And when you struggle to, reaching out for help. Friends, oh my God. That is actually probably what I'd say. I mean, I keep saying the word gratitude, but combined with loss and other certain difficult things that happened in the last year, calling on my friends and in grief and recovery, sort of like that healing process, the amount of times I found myself sort of saying the same thing over and over again. Like, why this, why that? And then feeling better at the end of the day for having been, listened to, and, my friends supporting me. And then the next day asking the same thing and feeling guilty that, like, why am I constantly coming back to my friends with the same discussion? They must be like bringing them down, and I'm bringing myself down and bringing them down with me. And it took talking to people where it's like, that's sort of, not like they have to be there, but they're there because they want to be. And that's what friends are there for. And they're there to sort of support you. And I wanted to take as much from that I could, from all that they were giving me, the energy, the time, the support, that I didn't want to go out there and then sort of like disrespect them or like sort of take advantage of what they said. So the friends in my life were incredibly, incredibly important and supportive. And they really gave me that foundation to feel like now at this point, having waited for the Bridgerton show, all the stuff that I sort of came out here to do, I feel like I've done a lot of work since Marvin had gone, since the winter. And that is from, loving myself, and honestly, big, big love to my friends.
I think that message of kind of reaching out is a great one. And also, it sounds to me like you were describing there with the kind of going back to your friends with the why question every day, is that feeling of something never ending. And that can happen in grief as well, and bereavement, where it feels like it's never ending. But of course, that isn't the case. But there are times when it might feel like that. And I think that's also a good message or a good thing to highlight. I'm just going to change tack slightly, Lucas, and ask, you've touched on this already, but do you ever think about your own death?
Definitely. In different ways to the death of people around me. It's scary, especially since, I feel like, I'm sort of doing what I set out to do and living my dream, and I'm excited to see the future of it, however it turns out. And of losing that is scary. But it goes back to the word gratitude. I think the idea of losing my mom or my dad, and I think more about them than I would Bella, my sister, because just they're older and they've been the caretakers. But if they were to be gone, like, what do I do when it comes to me? I mean, what is there to do? What is there to happen? So there's less sort of even tangible, sort of like applicable actions that are to do there, because you don't know. I've seen people lose their parents, and I've seen what it's done to them. I haven't seen someone reflect on their own death. And I think that's really what it is that it's like just completely unknown to me. And it is scary. It is scary, the thought of it ever happening.
One of the reasons I asked that question is because, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, one of the aims is to encourage conversations around death and dying, and even getting people to think about their own deaths. And we encourage people to think about their own deaths in a very practical sense as well. So one example of that is writing a will. And then lots of people say, well, I'm very young and I'm nowhere near death, so why would I write a will now? Or people say, well, I don't have anything to leave behind. But actually, everybody's probably got something. And what we do know is if people make some of those practical arrangements, regardless of their age, certainly like writing a will, then it makes things clearer for those who are left behind afterwards and left with the job of sorting things out.
There's also something I'd really like to mention.
Yeah, please do.
Coming on, I had a feeling of inadequacy, that because I hadn't sort of like lost my mom, or I keep talking about them, but if anything, it tells you just how important they are to me. And coming on to talk about death and loss without having lost those people that I'm so afraid of losing. Again, a bit of an imposter syndrome of like, should I really be coming on here and talking about this? And someone said something really nice, and it was simplified, where it's like, for things like on the Marie Curie Couch, diversity in stories. She reminded me that, like, you are enough. Your story is, you are worthy. You're all of that. Like, you are worthy to talk about something that, even if you think you haven't experienced the worst of it. And I know I haven't, but hearing my friends sort of say that, again, shout out to the friends, reminded me in a moment where I couldn't even see, the opportunity to be kinder to myself. She was like, no, you're all right. Your stories are valid. Your experiences are valid. And while you've had a lot of fortune in your life, those feelings that you experienced, the bad ones, or the hard ones, I should say, are valid and they're important. And so, I don't know. I wanted to say that for anyone who's listening going, well, why does my stories matter? It hasn't been that hard. It hasn't been as hard as that person or not. I think acknowledge it, because it gives you that much more weight. It gives you that much more, I don't know, fills me with more love, I guess. I just wanted to say that for anyone where it resonates.
Yeah, and I think it's a great message. And, what I would say back to that as well, which is what I said earlier, is that every relationship is unique. So therefore, every grief is unique. And so what I'd be saying is, don't compare, because it's not helpful. Literally, don't compare.
Of course.
But I know that's easier said.
It's tough.
And I know it's not. Yeah, really hard. It's really hard.
Again, it's hard to be kind to yourself sometimes. It's hard to, but that's what we're here for. That's why we surround ourselves with the right people.
I just want to ask, is legacy something that's important to you? So what your legacy will be?
I mean, ego is always an interesting thing, isn't it? And ego plays a big part when it comes to legacy.
Go for it.
Honestly, no. When you ask me, how do you feel about your death? I think I'm not too religious a person, and in moments of, I can be spiritual when I'm sort of alone with myself, or I've experienced something quite emotional. You're reaching out or anything, but I've enjoyed everything up to this point in my life so much. I've been very lucky. There's been ups and downs, but at this present moment right now, you and I speaking, the word that comes back is gratitude. I feel so lucky for the people around me, for the opportunities I've had, for the experiences I've had. And there are moments where you're like, I want to get that job, or I want to be in this project that's really going to make people see me, or, the ego as well, where you're like, oh, people from different parts of my life sort of seeing me do the thing that I said I was going to do. I know that that's not the healthy side of it. So I really do try to table that and sort of, even refute that at times. So beyond that, if that's sort of I don't think that's really helpful, then I guess sometimes I'm not too concerned with legacy. If it was all to stop now, if I were to go tomorrow, there'd be no regrets. I did everything. I did everything that I could. I did everything. I asked the people that I could. I feel like I'd done everything I'd set out to do. And while maybe inner child Lucas would, maybe one day dream of winning an Oscar or whatever, that's sort of that unbelievable sort of dream. Even moments now, I know that I just want to do the thing, which is act. I really enjoy acting, playing different characters, and having that sort of outlet is really, really fun for me. And being able to do that on some I don't know, being the lead, it's a dream of mine to be the lead in a sci-fi television series, or to be in a biopic where you recreate an actual person in life and sort of portray them. I want to do those things. And if I was to go tomorrow and I didn't do them, I did everything in my power to be able to put myself in a position to do them. So I guess my answer to the legacy thing is, sometimes I can get stuck in the idea of, I want to complete this so I can say I did. But really, what's driving me now is I just want to do. I just want to keep doing it and keep enjoying it and finding the play in it. Because that's what it is, after all. We're just playing.
Thank you. I was just thinking, he grafted, he worked hard, he was passionate about it, and he enjoyed it. That sounds nice. My last question is, how has it been being on the Marie Curie couch today and having these kinds of conversations, Lucas?
It surprised me. As I said, probably the main thing, even though I shouldn't have been thinking, it was are my stories adequate? Are my, these experiences adequate? I mean, people have experienced crazy things that really at first response would be, I don't know how I could manage with that. I've heard stories like that. But, having realizations with you, Jason, about again, I was not even going to talk about my grandfather Aurelio, but they're valid. I guess it's been beautiful. It's been a beautiful chat, and I'm so thankful to you for listening, and I'm thankful to anyone else who's cued in, and I'm excited to see how things change. as a result of, the conversations that we've had, the reflection I'm going to take away from this, and hopefully anyone else that has taken something from this. But it's been beautiful. Honestly, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to the charity itself, Marie Curie, for inviting me, and to you, Jason, for, asking these really important questions that we don't think about often enough. I don't, at least.
Well, Lucas Aurelio, thank you for joining me today on the Marie Curie Couch. Thank you for sharing some of Grandfather Aurelio's story, Grandpa Jean's, Marvin's, and of course Kitten. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate you.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help, from planning ahead to coping with bereavement. You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye.